From On The Go FM, this is Podcast Local, episode number 2. If you've listened to episode 1, you know that one was all about defining local podcasts and focusing on the most important element of local podcasting, which is telling stories. And in this episode, I wanted to give you a little bit of my background in podcasting and also a glimpse of the things that influenced me to start Podcast Local. Then, before episode 2 was finished, I got the call that my dad had died. He had been in the nursing home for a while. He had suffered from dementia, and anyway, he'd gotten sick, and they put him in hospice care for a few days, and then he passed away. So I ended up not releasing an episode that week, and instead we packed the car and drove to Alabama. We arranged a memorial service for him on a Wednesday, and then we drove back to Texas. And I had fully intended to release this episode last week, but I think the whole thing took a lot more out of us than we all realized. And frankly, a 10-hour drive with 2 preschoolers and a dog is very exhausting. And going back to Alabama to say goodbye to my dad reminded me that much of what I'm doing today, including this podcast and everything else associated with it, it's because of him. So, finally, here we go. This is episode 2. Now, if you just look at professional experience, the journey that led me to podcasting began a couple of years after I graduated from high school. The year was 1991, long before podcasting, but I was going nowhere with my formal education in that little junior college in Northwest Alabama. Nothing wrong with the school at all. It was just that I had other ideas of where I wanted to go for college, and that's a long story, I'll say for another episode. But anyway, I had just dropped a class, which put me at barely being enrolled at all. So, in, I guess, a half prayer, half thought, I said I needed to find work. I needed a job. Anyway, I went to my next class, and that was choir practice. Yeah, singing. It was a fairly recent skill I had discovered. Anyway, I went and sat in the bass section and waited for choir practice to start. And suddenly, the door to the room opened, and in walked one of the other bass singers. And the first words out of his mouth was, "Does anybody want to work at a radio station?" Seriously. Now, he had been working part-time at the local radio station, and they needed someone to take a night shift for a couple of days a week. So I went to the station and applied for the job. Took home some commercial scripts to practice, recorded a demo, and for some reason, that's still a mystery to me. I got the job. Now, I say it's a mystery because I've listened to the air checks from the early 90s, and if you've ever listened to my Meta podcast, then you might have heard those air checks too. So, I became a radio DJ in October 1991, and that's mostly what I did during the 90s. I worked at a couple of radio stations near my home, and I actually went back and forth between them a time or two. But I was also doing something else in the 90s. I was going back to school. Just a couple of classes here and there, but I kept taking steps toward some kind of degree. And that was something that eventually paid off in, well, very well. Not financially, but in other ways. And I'll get to that in a minute. But I had also discovered something in the mid to late 90s, mostly the late 90s, I guess. Specifically, what I found was digital media, digital editing. I mean, this is both audio and video and even images. I fell in love with it. Now, some of you know what I'm talking about. To me, the screen is my canvas, and digital editing software, it's my paints, my brushes. So, right here, let's jump ahead to the year 2000. I had taken about all the community college classes I could take, and my dad, it was a financially successful year, offered to get me into college in order to finish my degree. So I moved to Tuscaloosa and started to work on my communication degree at the University of Alabama. Pardon me, but roll Tide. I figured with all the classes I had taken, I'd be there for a couple of years and that'd be that. Well, I was actually there for 6 years. I finally did finish, and I am very thankful for that in so many ways. It's quite an experience being there at that time. Now, I was in an old major, telecommunication and film. My minor was communication studies. But anyway, the school was starting to transition into digital, and one of my professors had even started a new media experiment that I got to be a part of. And I was able to get experience on the television and video side of things, too. And eventually, I was called back into radio. This time, though, it was not a small-town country and gospel radio station. It was public radio. And it was a network with stations in Tuscaloosa, Florence, and Selma and Montgomery. And before I left, they were broadcasting into Huntsville. And off the air, I was learning how a radio station worked. I was an assistant to the operations manager and eventually took that role as well. And then the best thing happened. I met my wife. We met in the journalism department. We worked together at Alabama Public Radio, and we actually got married in the rotunda of Reese Pfeiffer Hall, the communications building. But then the second best thing happened. APR started podcasting. In 2006, we started taking certain radio shows and making them available as podcasts. Of course, NPR was way ahead of us on all of that, which was actually very exciting to watch. And also, I started learning. So I did, my job was to do like the necessary technical things like converting the files to MP3 and uploading them to our content management system. Also created the images we use for our podcasts. And then I started producing and hosting a show called Alabama Life. We usually didn't have the so-called hard news on that program. Instead, we focused on telling other stories of our state. I created 2 versions of Alabama Life. One was for broadcast and included a theme and music beds and interstitial music. And then I made a podcast version, which had none of that because of music copyright restrictions, which are still a problem for podcasters. Anyway, what we did with Alabama Life certainly played a role in the concept of Podcast Local. Now, I didn't know that at the time, but looking back, yes, Alabama Life was very much an influence in Podcast Local. Oh, by the way, I left Alabama Public Radio in 2007. My wife and I moved to Fort Worth, Texas, so I could get a seminary degree. But eventually, I started missing radio. I started listening to podcasts and discovered a few podcasts about podcasting, and then I decided to stop missing radio and begin podcasting. My first podcast that was not related to any kind of radio show was called Learning to Teach. I started that in 2013, and it was based on what I had been learning at seminary. I interviewed professors and students and spent the time exploring principles of teaching and learning. But then I discovered something unexpected and discouraging. Podcasting on my own without the support of the radio station and the radio station's equipment was quite a challenge. I mean, what equipment did I need? What could I actually afford? Where in my house can I record without noise or echo? Or like in the case right now, I am outside, so you don't hear the sounds of my kids. But at the time, choosing all of these things and figuring it out, it was tough. So that podcast didn't last too long. But you know what? I probably made it a lot more difficult than it needed to be. But that was part of the learning curve of podcasting on my own. All right, jump ahead to 2015. I had started rethinking what I really wanted to do with podcasting. And, the standard advice is to niche down as narrowly as possible and start a podcast, a blog, or a business on that. And that's a problem for people like me. I'm passionate about dozens of different things. So I started a podcast for practice only. Seriously, just for practice. And I did that because I knew I needed to be podcasting on a regular basis in order to improve and maintain my skills. And during the season of my podcasting for practice, I was listening to Rainmaker.fm and watching what they were doing with their podcast network and the Rainmaker platform. And I realized that that was the kind of thing that I wanted to do. So I got the domain onthego.fm. I started trying different things. I resurrected learning to teach with a focus on general principles of teaching that apply no matter who you are or what you teach. And then I started ideas for podcasting with the goal of exploring different ways to podcast. But there are a lot of ups and downs, and mostly downs in this story, it feels like sometimes. I was having trouble connecting with an audience with those shows. And I was getting burned out. And life was getting busy. So, as 2015 came to a close, I started thinking of something new. Something that would bring together all the concepts of podcasting for practice and the idea of podcasting about my favorite topic, which is podcasting. So January 1st, 2016, I started a Meta Podcast. It's a daily podcast about podcasts and podcasting and podcasters. In fact, when I started, I just wanted to do it for at least a month, every day, just to get into this and to get that practice, but a consistent practice. And then after January came to a close, I went ahead and did it in February too, and then March, and then a few more days into April until I got it up to 100 episodes. So the Meta Podcast, after 100 days, 100 episodes, I think it taught me more about podcasting than anything else I'd done before. I was able to focus on the idea of Podcast Local during that time, as well as our own local show for the city of Fort Worth. And I covered a few topics during that time that eventually will become podcasts of their own when the time is right. Time and experience will change you. You start down one path for good reasons or bad, intentionally or just drifting. But as you continue through time and space, you become a different person. You sometimes end up nowhere near where you expected. I think that's what I'm coming to, is that's how life works. You change. You're not the same as you were. You're not the same as you will be. Just remember who you've been, where you've been, what you've learned. Keep your commitments and keep going and keep growing.